Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel for the kickoff of the Cultural Heritage Game Jam with this morning or today, wherever you are in your time zone. My name is Tim Cullings. I'm the Director of Operations for Global Game Jam. Today, sorry, we have a few esteemed panelists joining us who I'll give them each a chance to introduce themselves and start with Ashley.
Hi, my name is Ashley Fry. I'm an Indigenous Affairs Officer with the U.S. Department of State's Cultural Heritage Center. Tim, did you want me to give like a bio or did just introduce myself?
You can just start with introducing yourself. Okay, and then Paula, feel free to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Paula Esquadra, she, her pronoun.
Yeah. And thank goodness our jobs aren't entirely technology based.
I know, yeah, oh my gosh.
All right, I think we're back now. Yeah, it looks like we're good. Anyways, yeah, we're still waiting on Dr. Callahan to join us. If she does, we'll bring her in onto the panel, but it's 5 a.m. where she is, so she might still be sleeping. Hopefully she'll wake up and see it and join us at some point, but if not, we'll just go right into the questions that I have here for you. So if you don't mind talking a little bit about your involvement in cultural heritage and why preservation and protection is important to you. Oh, apparently they missed Charlie's intro, so if you want to go back and do that, that'd be great.
Yep, okay. So, hi, I'm Charlie. I'm from Scotland. I'm a games researcher. My research focuses on the use of digital games to preserve Indigenous languages, cultures, and traditions. And part of that is that I run the Kilted Otter Initiative, which is a research-based extended games jam that only focuses on Indigenous languages, cultures, heritages, and traditions.
Nice. Yeah, so why don't you start then? Talk a little bit about your involvement in cultural heritage and why preservation and protection is important to you.
Okay, so for me, I've spent a lot of years living in different countries. So I lived in China for 8 years. I lived in Italy for a year. I've done a lot of work with Latin America. And it occurred to me that whilst I've been doing a lot of work with other cultures, other communities, other languages, I've really done nothing for my own culture. And whilst living in China, I was the only Scot in a very small city in China. So that's only 12 million people. And I was the only one from my country, the only one with these. So no one had commonalities with me. So my culture and my heritage is very, very important to me. And it's something that I'm immensely interested for other people to learn about their cultures, their heritage, their traditions, and to be able to share that. And games are the perfect medium to be able to do that with. And so that's where my research and my passion comes from.
Nice. How about you, Paula?
Oh, I mean, I think Charlie and I bonded over this exact point. Is that so? I'm an immigrant woman of color, and part of my own lived experience has been kind of rediscovering my cultural roots and the impacts that climate change has had on local and indigenous communities of color. And so I'm still, I'm finding my own path to forging like new connections with what came before me. And in addition to that, with today's cultural and political landscape, many of us are becoming aware or acutely have been aware that many of the systems that we have in place have marginalized voices and identities and opportunities for people of color. And so when we're thinking about how our history is told and who gets a chance to tell it and who gets to influence it, there's a lot of conversation about that and the power and insights that we can gain by preserving and protecting those stories and all the ways in which they are visible and heard on the planet that we're on are really important. And alongside that, the IGDA Climate SIG is really focused on working with game developers and building resources for game developers to enable them to engage in climate action in ways that work in their context. And in the creation of resources, we need to make sure we have an intersectional component to that, where we're thinking about the sustainable development goals, we're thinking about how to apply them from a design.
It's the sugar, man. It got you through it.
It's like it's
I
coming
know.
back. All right. Yeah, we're back. All right. I think everybody heard up to what Paula said, so Ashley, if you want to take that question.
Sure. So I come at this sort of from an Indigenous perspective. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, which is a federally recognized tribe within the United States. And when I was in college, I majored in art history. I really liked seeing a visual representation of history. And through that, I decided that I wanted to work directly with Indigenous artists and craftspeople. So my first job really out of school was working for the U.S. Department of Interior, where I got to work directly with those artists, with the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. It's a small agency within the larger department. But I really got to see the impact of consumerism on art and craft work that were made by members of federally recognized tribes, and the importance of perpetuating their thriving culture. And because of that, I also became interested in historical perspectives on art and craft work through or from Indigenous communities. And so at the Department of State, I work a lot on international repatriation. So cultural items and ancestral remains that are in foreign collections, working with foreign museums and tribes within the U.S. To repatriate items back to their communities.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. So how do you think the medium of video games can impact people's perception of this issue and lead to greater awareness and action? We can start with Ashley, I guess, and go in reverse order.
Sure. I mean, I think that whenever you see somebody who looks like you and has similar stories to yours, it's always impactful. It's important. Representation is important. And it creates an awareness for people who may not be familiar, especially with Indigenous cultures, because I think a lot of time these cultures are believed to be sort of historical, right? They're currently in existence, and people are living these lives today. So I think inclusion in video games is important because it brings those traditions to a larger audience. And there's an example of a video game that was created a few years ago, Never Alone, that incorporates Indigenous languages, Indigenous style graphics in the game. And I believe that the game was created in the company partnered with the Cook Inlet tribe in Alaska. And then there were also accompanying documentary style features with the game. And I think, including the languages, the visuals, and also having that documentary element is important to sort of give a wider view of the cultures instead of just seeing them and playing through a character on screen, but also introducing these concepts and communities to younger audiences will help perpetuate these the appreciation of Indigenous cultures.
Yeah, totally. Paula, how about you?
Sure. I don't know if I could say it better than the way Ashley said it. So video game developers we're inherently storytellers, as Ashley said, and we have. I know it often doesn't feel like it when we're day in and day out trying really hard not to crunch or are crunching, but we have a significant global platform and we have access to potentially over 3 billion players all over the place. And so we have a lot of power to influence people's perceptions of what was, what is, what can be. And we do so in a way that other forms of storytelling like may just not be able to, because we enable people to interact with it. And so there's so many big problems in the world that can be extremely overwhelming for us as individuals. This is exacerbated by ongoing imposter syndrome that I deal with on a day-to-day basis about like, what can I do? It's a really big problem. I just make games. Like, what if nothing I do matters? And we get into that shame spiral all the time, and it's totally understandable. But what's really cool to me about video games is that we have a really unique way to redefine our relationship with failure. And when we're dealing with big problems where like failure can have massive consequences, it is really, really great for video games to provide an opportunity for hope and an opportunity for us to like face those really big challenges and not be afraid to try again if we fail. Because that perseverance actually builds resiliency that can be applied to real world challenges. And that's what makes it really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the problem of going last after two amazing speakers, that I just have to say games are fun. For me, I think something that games, touching on what Paula said there, they give you an interaction. So it's not the same as reading a book or watching a film or a documentary, which is a passive skill. A game is an active skill. You're involved in that game. You're immersed in that. And for a second, you might feel a touch of what it's like to be facing those challenges, facing those issues, or a simulation of. And with games, we have the power to change but not preach. And I think that's really important, to educate without it being explicit education. It's implicit. It's something that you'll play, I don't know, Assassin's Creed, and you might have ended up learning something about the Egyptian Empire, but you didn't necessarily set out to learn that. And going back to what Ashley said, representation in games is something really important. If we look at, I don't know, I hate to say it, but Cyberpunk 2022 that came out, the amount of modifications you could make, and in fact, the number of streams I watched where the first 3 hours of the stream were just people playing with making the avatar look like them, because they'd never been able to have that skin color or actually represent their own nose. It's these little things, and it means a lot to people. My son's half Chinese, half Scottish. He doesn't see himself in any form of media. And that's something quite isolating when you think about it. And that's not just him. The other factor, as a Scot myself, we are represented, but we're not represented well in video games. Scots are usually dwarves, grumpy, wearing kilts and fighting. We don't do that all the time. Sometimes, but not all the time. So it's about honest representation of who we are. But the one thing that I find is most important is sovereignty. So if you're going to make a game and have it about, like the game you mentioned, Never Alone, where the people the game was about were involved in that, and this idea of nothing about us without us, but also it's their story to tell. Some things aren't able to be shared, and they shouldn't be shared. They're not for a wider populace, but we can use games to preserve these traditions, these heritages, for the people themselves. So games that made by all of the work of Elizabeth Leponce, who is an amazing games designer and academic. Carl Peterson made Tipikaga, which sadly never went on to be fully developed. But all of these games are Indigenous created, Indigenous owned, and it's their heritage that wasn't meant for everyone, but it was meant to preserve. And that's something that games can allow us to do. They can allow us to do something in an active way, in that kinesthetic style of learning, watching and then doing, which is often quite tied to in pedagogies as well.
Yeah, Great points. You already kind of answered this yourself, but what are some of the challenges faced in making impactful games about these topics?
So there's a lot of challenges, and one of the ones that I think, is most frustrating is a lot of the indigenous peoples that are making these games, and sadly Phyllis can't be here or isn't here yet. But she made a game called Katuku Island, which is about giving pride back to Maori people for being Maori. It's giving them the right to be proud of who they are and preserving their heritage. Again, the work of Elizabeth Laponce. A lot of these indigenous games developers, games designers are making amazing games, but they're not getting the funding. They're not getting the funding to be able to make a triple A level game. But more than that, and more importantly, they're not getting the funding to be able to promote, to market these games in a way that would make them available or known to a mass market worldwide. And that's something that is a huge problem, I think, with indigenous games developing, because the money's just not there.
Yeah, excellent points. The funding is always an issue for everyone. How about you, Paula? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, funding is really huge, especially when we think about how the cultural zeitgeist our industry is currently experiencing right now from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, as well as an accessibility standpoint. Like, there's a lot of paradigm shifts that need to happen about like what games can be successful in the market, who we're marketing it to, and how to get your return on investment. And a lot of conversations about that are changing given the values that we're evolving in our field. And so a big piece of that funding element is getting a seat at the table to make those resourcing decisions. Like, that's a big one. Alongside that, like, vulnerability is really hard to manage and deal with. We have, peers, colleagues, managers, directors who have the ability to fund new initiatives that can raise new voices that have been historically marginalized in our industry. But change aversion is real. And it's hard to admit when we have been complicit to systems of oppression, even when we like intend to do the best thing possible for our players and our developers. And that's also exacerbated by the fact that often like indigenous, like people of color, are not in positions of leadership. And so cultural expertise is often not in-house and may be hired in a limited capacity, or are tokenized, which just perpetuates the biases that we have. And that creates challenges that prevent us from being able to not only create games that can have the impact that we're looking to serve, but measure it in meaningful ways.
Yeah, those are all good points. I feel like as an industry, we're starting to like slowly get better than just token representation, but it's a long process, and some people are resistant to that sort of thing. But hopefully, over time, it'll get better as more of those types of creators get into the industry and are making games themselves. How about you, Ashley? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I really did want to touch on avoiding stereotypes or generalizations when you're portraying Indigenous communities, especially. And also, I hope that we're getting to a point where we're moving past this, but I think it's still cultural appropriation is still a huge issue. And then also thinking about providing information in a way that is still engaging to people who are playing a game. So not making something overly burdensome or obvious, but in a way that you play a game and think, like Charly had mentioned, saying, "Oh, I think I may have learned something along the line, along the lines of me playing this game. I didn't come into it thinking I was going to do that, but doing it in a way that's subtle and not obvious, and in a way that would make somebody want to turn off a game because it was too much like a sermon or something like that, right?"
Oh yeah, I just to chime in really quick, like I think that's the exact, like that's one of the big tensions that we have from a design standpoint, definitely, is that like we often run into the assumption that like if we put in serious topics into video games, like it ruins the fun, like my immersion's broken, I'm leaving. And like the reality is that all of our video games are grounded in what we perceive to be possible. And so making sure that the stories that we tell and the mechanics that we create add value to the game experience and aren't just slapped on top as like, yay, we're doing something about it. We'll make it so that we can get past that barrier and provide a meaningful experience. So strong +1 to everything she said.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, did you have anything to add? Okay. So along those lines, how can we better include the people from various cultures to make sure they are well represented when making games about preserving their heritage? Anyone who wants to take that can start.
Well, I mean, the phrase that was told to me by Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation elder is nothing about us without us. And that is something that I've carried through everything I've done so far now. That this idea of, oh, I know I've done some reading about your culture, and I think I've made this game that your people will really like. But in no step of that design or development process have I included anyone from your culture. And then you just sort of package it as, now you should be thankful that I've done this for you. That's absolutely not what should be done at all. Everyone should be involved in the whole design development process. And it's not just in the case of, I mean, Assassin's Creed 3, they had the half Cherokee character. They did bring in an Indigenous advisor at the end when it was already decided and the research had already been done. So that was more, whilst it was, the advisor had said what you've done is good and fine, they should have been involved along the way. There's a lot of games that haven't had Indigenous advisors, even though they've made games about certain peoples and cultures, and they've got it horrendously wrong. So that people need to be involved. And the other side of that is there's many communities, many cultures of people who have amazing talents, but don't understand that their talents can be useful for the game industry. Game industry isn't just programming, and it's not just for boys, it's for everyone. And the idea that, you're an artist, you're an amazing artist, that could be useful. You could use that. You could, transfer that skill into the games industry, and giving people the opportunity, giving people the skills to be able to create these things for themselves, I think is really important. And again, that touches on the cultural appropriation idea, where if I do it for you, is it right? Even though my intentions are good, it's not always the best way.
Yeah, totally. That's what we're all about here at the Global Game Jam, is inclusion and making everybody feel like they can make a game and learn how to make games. And so that's great. How about you, Paula?
Sure. I mean, +1 to everything Charly said. I mean, at bare minimum, hire voices of color, pay them for their expertise, pay them for their participation. When you're doing research about a story that you want to tell, at minimum, start with a Google search and identify organizations who may be willing to partner with you. And ask them for their input. And if resources are limited, and you're a small studio or an individual developer just trying to make an experience that is really important to you, when you're promoting your game and you're designing your game, like, have representatives of those communities participate with you. And when we go on live streams on Twitch, or we're doing Let's Plays, or we're doing blog posts, like, create a platform to help elevate their voices as well as your own. And there's many different ways that we can do that. But I think in the ideal case, and what we should strive for, like, we should definitely move past the concepts of hiring a cultural expert for a specific project. Like, we should put people and sponsor people and mentor people to be in positions of influence and power so that those voices can be heard, and we can celebrate them the right way.
Yeah, any thoughts on that, Ashley?
I mean, I think that both Paula and Charly stole my talking points, but I think that I just want to underscore working directly with a population or community that you're representing and working with them from the beginning. And this isn't quite the same thing, but with the federal government, we have a duty to consult with tribal leaders and tribal governments. And if we come to tribes with an idea that's completely gelled, that we have already sort of made the decision that this is the way that we're going forward, and this is the concept that we've come up with, and that's what we're going with, it's not met with open arms usually. And so I think that engaging with communities and Indigenous populations or peoples from the very beginning and understanding what parts of their culture they are willing to share, and not making an assumption that something or a tradition or a way of life or an art form is something for general consumption. So being aware of sensitivities, and also, I really enjoyed the use when I was watching the Never Alone video game, the use of Indigenous languages, because a lot of these languages are in danger of dying out. And so if we're able to preserve and perpetuate them through the use of language and native speakers in video games, I think that that's also really important.
Yeah, great points.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, the knowledge holders, the people who speak these native languages and have the stories and have the knowledge, a lot of that knowledge isn't written down. So as people pass, as the knowledge holders pass, that knowledge goes, and that little piece of culture, and that could be a family recipe, that could be a story that's been passed down for generations, and that goes because the younger generations were denied or forced not to speak their native language. And that's really, really upsetting. There's now situations where there are knowledge holders, but they're not able to do the proper translation because the intermediary people, you've got English speakers and native speakers, but there's no one in between who can act as that kind of active translator. So even in active cultures, words and phrases, jargon according to their lives are disappearing. And that, if we can help preserve that in games, why shouldn't we?
Yeah. And if I may, sorry, is it okay if I piggyback on that?
Yep,
okay. And to think about more of the and thinking about beyond oral history, which is incredibly important to the preservation of Indigenous culture and history. It's also important to think about the physical historical sites and physical historical monuments and how we're thinking about preserving those, not only from environmental standpoint, but in terms of the records that we have as the U.S. government. And Ashley, please feel free to correct me if I misrepresent anything I'm about to say. But the point about oral history and preserving those as they're at risk of being erased. There are many different ways that we can experience and witness erasure. When thinking about the National Register of Historical Places in the US, there's a list of almost 100,000 sites that have been designated as worthy of preservation. And there are tax and grant programs that enable the preservation and rehabilitation as well as the conservation of those sites. But the system isn't built to deal with the unfunded cost of climate change. And there aren't standardized best practices necessarily, and support for those is very fragmented. And plus, it's important for us to think about how a lot of these systems were built on false interpretations of American history. So what do we consider influential, what we consider valuable? And much of the impact of women and people of color on American history have been erased or marginalized. And so the sites and monuments that celebrate these stories are slowly being added to those being erased in this under-resourced program. And so there are many different ways that we can and should acknowledge erasure, and also many different ways for us to kind of revisit that and tell that story through video games and like raise visibility for these different aspects of a system that is making it difficult for us to do this.
Yeah. Thanks. We do have a question from chat that from Morocco Marauder. How is climate change putting Indigenous heritage at risk? And it probably makes sense to start with Paula on that one.
Sure. I mean, I think that just from the impact on the physical state standpoint, many of the archaeological sites that we have all over the world are at risk of being lost or damaged as a result of sea level rise. And so like I think the Southeast United States alone has 13,000 sites that are at risk of being completely lost or damaged just with 3 feet of sea level rise. And so we can imagine what the damage could be like with like 5 or 8 projected feet of global sea level rise. And communities, particularly those that have been marginalized, who are historically under-resourced, are those most adversely impacted by our, social, cultural, economic, environmental systems that haven't accounted for that. And the Global South in particular has to deal with life-threatening hardship today. And even in the United States, in very industrialized areas, we are starting to see climate change, refugees having to move as a result of the extreme weather that they're having to experience that's creating adverse health effects. That's one example. I could keep talking, so I'll let other people speak.
Wondering if Ashley has any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think the threat of climate change is not just to tangible cultural heritage, but also intangible cultural heritage and communities, their traditional life ways, and storytelling, language, again, pushing these indigenous populations, like in the Arctic, for example, out of their traditional homelands to find work, to be able to sustain their lives, and pushing them into larger cities where they're sort of swallowed up by the existing multicultural communities that are in those larger cities. But some indigenous communities are on the forefront of sort of changing their own communities for the better. There's a First Nations in Canada, the Vuntut Gwitchin, who have worked with, they've received some grants from the federal and provincial governments for significant solar power and infrastructure within the community, and they declared a climate emergency for their First Nations. And the Scotts Valley Pomo Indians in California are also working on projects that can sort of counter climate issues within their areas, especially in California, where wildfires are a big part of climate crisis there. The tribe is using woody biomass and high fire areas, and they're using that, they're transforming that into clean energy. So, I think that looking to indigenous populations and communities for ways that we can all work on countering the climate crisis is important.
Definitely. I mean, this isn't my area of expertise at all, but through working with people and through talking to different Indigenous communities, there needs to be a turn where we turn back to the Indigenous communities and look at how they deal with the environment, how they deal with water protection, because it wasn't them that messed it all up. And that honor, the idea of respecting the environment, respecting nature, and not taking it all for granted is something that a lot of Indigenous communities have very deep within their ethoses, and it's something that we can learn from. Science wasn't invented by white men in the 1400s. Science existed, medicine existed way before Europe existed. It just didn't have that name. There was Indigenous practices everywhere that covered these things. And so turning back and finding out more natural ways to approach the environment, approach the climate change, I think is something that we really need to do. But I'm not an expert, so that's only my opinion.
I'll say another quick example of one of those practices. I think that oh man, I just lost it. No. So an example of this is in the coastal and river communities in India, where they have portable building techniques to help move their monasteries as a result of flooding. And they've been adapting to changing sea levels for centuries. There's also studies coming out about adobe housing being more resilient to climate change because it's several degrees cooler. We don't have to deal with these gigantic buildings that don't reflect heat as well. And so there's so much opportunity to raise awareness and visibility and advocacy for Indigenous practices that can enable us to protect our environment. And so much of this has been erased due to colonialism and industrialization. And I'm so excited for games to have this opportunity to build more resilient societies by connecting with these cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. And along those lines, I was wondering how you think technologies will impact the preservation and protection of cultural heritage, both from a positive and negative standpoint. Maybe we can start with Ashley on that one.
So, I do think that in the future, we will see an increase in technology use and tools for predicting climate outcomes within cultural heritage preservation areas. I think that a couple of pitfalls that could be encountered would be an over-reliance on that technology. And again, the technology is also only as reliable as the data that it's been given. And then I also want to mention a lot, with Instagram and Facebook and people advertising where they're going and visiting naturally beautiful locations and geotagging those locations. A lot of Indigenous sacred areas are beautiful and are desolate, but with increased tourism to certain areas and with climate change opening up tourism, like in the Arctic, it's bringing in more people to see these sites, which is partially wonderful, but then they're at risk of being overrun by people coming to visit and not respecting the land, the culture, and the cultural resources that might be in those areas.
Yeah, totally. These, ancient sites aren't built to handle the amount of foot traffic they get sometimes, and that leads to destruction in its own way with erosion and those types of things. How about you, Charlie? Any thoughts about technology and the impact?
Yeah, so many thoughts, but I'll kind of keep them sort of short. Just to piggyback off what Ashley said there, so we have the islands, the Western Isles of Scotland, and there's one particular, so the Isle of Skye, and has a beautiful structure, like a weird wind-shaped rock structure. And we want to share that, but we don't want it overrun by tourists, because as soon as lockdown happened and people couldn't go away to Spain or America or wherever on holiday, people traveled around our wonderful country. And unfortunately, that meant rubbish, litter, all of the horrible things about the modern society just being left everywhere. These are places that aren't necessarily able to cope with massive footfall. So even in my very, very small country, I 100% feel what you're saying there, Ashley. The good side of technology is that it opens the world to us. I mean, look at this. I'm in Scotland and it's almost nighttime here. and I'm doing this amazing panel with you guys in America. Like, that couldn't happen without technology, and we need to praise technology for that. But we also have this sense of privilege, or this lack of understanding, that not everyone has access to this. Not everyone has access to internet or laptops, or not everyone can design a game, not because they don't have the ability, but because they don't have access to the tools. One of my friends is born and raised on a reservation, and he was telling me how expensive the internet is there. Like, it's unmanageable. And unless these prices become the equivalent of what normal people pay, or, well, not normal people, but everybody should pay the same rate. And then it becomes something that is accessible to all. We can't have these exclusionary barriers. Where I live, there's a lot of places without internet, and that's because most of us live on mountains, so it's understandable. But we all pay the same price for internet. But technology, we talk about VR, we talk about PlayStation 5s. I can't afford a PlayStation 5. Not everyone can afford this, and this assumption that everyone is able to. And until prices come down to a level that is acceptable for everyone, or good work, or donations, or something, some initiatives to give these tools, these technologies to people that wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity, I think that's something we need to really seriously think about.
Yeah, those are good points. And I was recently talking to a community organizer in India who was saying that, game consoles basically don't exist there, that people just play games on their phones, and like they're just going to start rolling out 5G nationwide, I guess, and it's going to open things up there to make things more accessible. But it's just something that we, at least in the Western culture, take for granted, and not everybody has it, so it's something that you have to think about as well. So what do you... Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add something in there about, Western cultures having access to readily available internet and broadband. And, that's something that domestically with tribal communities here in the U.S., that's not necessarily the case. That their broadband access is still something that we as the federal government are trying to increase. And so even people living on reservations within the U.S. don't necessarily have access to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a stumbling block that we also still have to overcome here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. We run into that with like rural sites for Global Game Jam too, where broadband access is either not available or too expensive, and people are on slow connections, and that makes it harder for them to join. So it's not just a problem globally, it's a problem here too, so that's something to keep in mind. So what do you hope that game creators participating in the Game Jam will learn or take away from their experience? How about Ashley, we can start with you.
I mean, I think that the people who are participating in the Game Jam probably already recognize the importance of representation and the protection of cultural heritage. Otherwise, they wouldn't have signed up for this. But I hope what they take away is just that there is a community of people who do consider this to be very important, and they're not, out there on their own trying to develop a game that encompasses these topics, but that there's hopefully a market for these types of games as well. That I think everything that Charly and Paula have said is very important, and it's been very illuminating to me, and sort of coming at this as a non-gamer, if you couldn't tell, but as somebody who really does care about cultures and cultural heritage preservation, I'm very happy to see that there is a community of people who takes this very seriously and wants to include it in games that they use to, for entertainment. I think taking that away is that's what I'm taking away, and I hope that's what others take away as well.
How about you, Paula?
I mean, I think like first and foremost, I hope that this opportunity gives people who are passionate about games, make games, play games. Like I hope it helps us realize and remember that we have more power than we think we do. And working with others will make action and progress move a little bit more quickly. And peer support, especially with these game jam experiences, is so critical to not only our ability to make a game, but also just to provide care for ourselves. Like we're dealing with major existential threats that can be very easily overwhelming on a day-to-day basis. And if you pair that with the civil rights movement that's happening right now, and the pandemic and just surviving, like just trying to pay the bills and stay sane, and be willing to get out of bed every day, like that's huge. And so finding community events and projects that drive you, and are able to give you these moments of hope, and then forging a path together with the communities you really, really want to help, bring visibility to and power to and speak truth to power is critical. And video game developers are very inspirational forces of change for that.
Massive plus one, definitely. And but adding to that, if you fancy making a game, you'd like to try it, but you don't think you have the skill, try it. What's the worst that could happen? Maybe you're not coming into this from a game side. Maybe you're coming into this from a cultural heritage side. Then have a shot. There's enough software out there or middleware where you can make a game without having to code, where there's assets where you don't need to be an artist. You can make a game. Anyone can make a game. That's my firm belief in life. Look at children in a playground. They make games up all the time. So what's the worst that could happen? If you want to do it, do it. Just have a go and share your culture with the world. Share what makes you special, because our culture and our heritage is what makes us us and what makes us special. And everyone should have the chance to experience that and experience each other's cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. We sort of answered. One person had a question in chat. They said, "I have a story, but my game is science fiction. Is that acceptable?" Um, Anyone have any thoughts about making a science fiction based game around this topic?
I would say, why not? We had this for my own game jam, the Kilted Otter Initiative. Someone had this same question, and they wanted to do like the Highland Games. So in Highland Games is a traditional Scottish event where basically men throw trees because they can. And could we do that in space? Why not? Like zero gravity caber tossing, bring it on. If you're using the culture, you're sharing the culture. It doesn't have to be boring or dull. We're not wanting encyclopedia books here. What we're wanting is fun, playable games, an emphasis on the word fun. So I would not have any problem with. I mean, oh come on, someone's got to do something with dinosaurs.
Right? Dinosaurs are so much fun.
It's begging to be made. Like, I don't know, traditional Scottish people on dinosaurs. I'm down for that. I'm here for that game.
Yeah, I totally agree. I always like dinosaurs. There's one more question that might be a little bit more challenging to answer, but essentially they're asking, how do you see games creating empathy, for example, around effects of climate change? Is it similar? Is it desirably to be like subtle rather than like overt in that sort of way, or are there opportunities to be overt? Is sort of what they're asking.
Oh man, this could be like an entire panel on its
Right.
own. I mean, I
Yeah.
think, and I would say like, I think to repeat what's already been wonderfully said before, I think games enable us an opportunity to experience things that we may not have access to in the real world. And a lot of us go to games and interactive experiences because there is a need unfulfilled in the real world. So in the pandemic, I've craved social connection, so I play games to do that. I'm feeling down, down, so I play a game that enables me to feel a sense of achievement and I feel better. And so I think it certainly the subtlety versus explicitness of the content that you're producing really depends on the audience and the type of impact you're looking to create. An educational game that is really meant to specifically like scaffold instruction and scaffold specific learning objectives will have very different ways, different approaches, compared to a game that is really focused on the emotional connection that a player may have with a character that they're playing or experiencing or engaging with. So I think yes, and it depends.
I would 100% agree with that. Games have, because through the immersion when playing a game, they have the amazing power to be tremendously emotive. I mean, I can't tell you the number of games I've sat and blubbed through as the end credits roll and like my favorite character has died, or The Last of Us. That's this War of Mine. These are games that they get you, they grab you by the heart, but they're not slapping you in the face with "you will learn." You're learning as you go along, but the emotion that you feel in these games is something that I don't think I would have the same experience if I was just watching a film kind of thing. So I think it's the other thing with trying to elicit emotion from people is you can't always do it. So, you try and put something funny in a game, it's really funny to you. Maybe no one else finds it funny. So all of these kind of things are so subjective, but go in with an open heart. And if you're wanting to change someone's idea or make someone see something from another point of view, then a game is a perfect tool for that, because of the immersion, because the players are in that moment. They're playing that character. They are attached to that character. They care if they live or die, or if they're able to feed their family, or if their homeland is being destroyed, because you are that character. You've embodied it. And that's where the emotional tie comes in, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Any thoughts on that, Ashley?
I mean, I think that gaming when you're playing a game, it's essentially your involvement with a story, right? And I think that now is the time to not be subtle about climate change and the effects of climate change on certain communities, well, all communities really. But, if you're a part of that story, just exactly what Charly said, and you are invested emotionally in that journey and that story, and climate change plays a part of that story, I see no reason why you shouldn't be subtle about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, thanks everyone. This has been a great discussion. Do you have any final thoughts for our jammers, or ways that they can connect with you or follow your work online? How about, I'll start with Ashley.
More than welcome to check out the Cultural Heritage Center's website on the U.S. State Department, through the U.S. State Department's website. I'm happy to provide any additional contact information to Tim if people are interested in getting in touch with us as well.
Excellent. Paula, how about you?
Sure. I think I posted it in the chat, but the IGDA Climate SIG has a fairly active Discord where we're constantly talking about climate change, for better or for worse. And so Charly and I are on there. Everybody is welcome to join and engage in conversation, see what we're up to, or just go there if you want to find like-minded people to vent to about the things that we're worried about or processing. It's a safe space to kind of explore all that.
Yeah, I'm there too once in a while. How about you, Charly?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a great Discord, and it's really good to find like-minded people, and even if you're not active in discussions, to read what other people are thinking. And sometimes you're like, wow, I think that too. I'm on Twitter at Charly Harbord, but without the space between the name. The Kilted Otter is on Twitter, but it's Otter Kilted. If you look for Kilted Otter on Twitter, you may get something else instead. So just be aware. It's Otter Kilted. The Jam is opening up for more cultures next year. We will have Maori, First Nations, and Lakota Sioux taking part in the Indigenous Language Jam. For advice for your jammers, give it a shot. Find the fun, and most important, get your game tested. Play the game yourself, but also get other people to play the game. Share things, look at my art, what do you think about this? But games are supposed to be fun, so don't break yourself making it. Just have fun with it. If you have fun, we'll have fun playing them.
Can't agree more. That's a great note to end on. So I want to thank you all for joining us this morning or today, wherever you are, what time it is there. Really appreciate it. This was a great discussion, and I hope everyone got some great information and inspiration out of it and goes on to make some super fun and awesome games. Goodbye, everyone, and have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.